Akarshit, please go live. So we are now live, ma'am. So
Mhm.
it is, like I said, it is my sheer privilege to welcome Professor Ruth Vanitha for this very special talk on many levels. Also because it is the new kind of world that we are in. I had always thought I will meet with her in person and discuss many things in detail, of course, which I'm sure she may not have so much time for, but will be kind enough to address some of them. But still, she agreed in this virtual world to connect with me virtually. I just can't, I don't have enough words to thank you, ma'am. Before I begin, I'll briefly introduce her, though she doesn't need any introduction, but still, uh, Ruth Vanitha taught at Delhi University for 20 years and now is a professor at University of Montana. She volunteered as founding co-editor of Manushi from 1978 to 1990 and was active member in the Indian women's movement during these years. She is the author of several books, including Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage in Modern India, Gender, Sex and City, Urdu Rekhti Poetry in India, 1780 to 1870, Dancing with the Nation, Courtesans in Bombay Cinema. She has also co-edited The Pioneering Same-Sex Love in India. Her first novel, Memories of Light, appeared in 2020, which is about a poignant romance between two courtesans unfolding in the Nawabi era Lucknow, which is much before the 377. So it is a very significant intervention in creative writing that ways. She's the author of over 60 articles on British and Indian literature and has translated many works of fiction and poetry from Hindi and Urdu. She's currently completing a book on the dharma of justice in the epics. Personally, I also like her voice and the way she intermingles Hindi, English, and Urdu whenever she speaks. I have heard her so many times on YouTube videos. So for me, it is a pleasure that I'm hosting this particular talk. Over to you, ma'am. Looking forward to listen to you.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. Thank you for inviting me and for that kind introduction. So I'm going to talk about my novel, Memory of Light, which appeared last month from Penguin as a paperback and also as an ebook. I'm going to talk about the way I drew on my earlier interdisciplinary work in the humanities to write this novel. Um, so, as Priyanka said, Memory of Light tells the story of passionate love between a poet and a dancer. The story is narrated by the poet Nafis Bai, who lives in a kota in Lucknow about 200 years ago, and is looking back at her life. She remembers the ups and downs over many years of her relationship with Chapla Bai of Kashi, who visited Lucknow when both of them were young. Nafis also recounts the loves, friendships, rivalries, and enmities of the women, men, and transgender people who live in a household and neighborhood or who visit it. So these include local people, people from other cities, foreigners, there are Hindus, there are Muslims, there are Christians, there are traders, tawaifs, noblemen, there are servants such as nursemaids, palanquin bearers, cooks. Most importantly, there are the male poets who are Nafisa's friends and colleagues, since she and Chapla are also poets and almost everyone writes some poetry. In this novel, I drew on my research for my earlier book on Urdu poetry in Lucknow. This book is called Gender, Sex, and the City. And for this book, I read numerous 18th and 19th century poems and prose writings, both published and from manuscripts, which were written in Urdu. And at that time, Urdu was called Hindi, usually called Hindi, which means the language of Hind, as opposed to Farsi. So I translated many of these poems for the first time, and some of the poems, a few, appear in the novel. The novel highlights the importance of women, especially courtesans, to the cultural life of cities at the time, like Delhi, Lucknow, Banaras, Hyderabad, Agra. Just as the British, through their laws and education system, later denigrated and destroyed the openness of same sex relationships, so also they destroyed the institution of courtesans. And this is partly their doing and partly the result of other economic and political changes. Courtesans were highly educated and accomplished women who lived in matrilineal houses. They were among the very few women um, who owned immovable property in their own names. Historian Veena Oldenburg has found that they were the only women in the highest income tax bracket in 19th century Lucknow. By studying records, I found that dancers employed at court, just to give you an idea of the salaries, they earned as much, one dancer earned as much in a month as was the budget of the state hospital for the month. Courtesans were not sex workers. They had long-term relationships with men, or what we would now call serial monogamy, sometimes one for all one's life and sometimes two or three, but one after the other. Several of them also became the junior wives of kings, noblemen, and businessmen. So in my book, Dancing with the Nation, I explore the way courtesans shaped Indian cinema's ideas, and therefore modern Indians' ideas, of single women, single mothers, working women, and also of the erotic. And of course of art, of dance and song. For this book, I examined courtesan characters in 235 films, and I showed how cinema gradually equated courtesans with sex workers, much has happened in real life as well. I discovered that cities of the time were centers of a rich and vibrant pre-colonial culture that I consider, I've argued, is a modern culture. One feature of modernity is the self-conscious hybridity of the culture. Every culture is hybrid, but to be conscious of that hybridity and sort of explore it is a different thing. Writers of the time were conscious of the linguistic, religious, regional, gender, and sexual hybridities, and they record these in their writings. For example, my favorite poet of the time, Insha Allah Khan Insha, he wrote the first book about Urdu grammar, which of course is no different from Hindi grammar. In this book, he records words, he gives a list of words from numerous languages, and he writes about them, such as Punjabi, Marwari, Arabic, Sanskrit, Persian, Purbi, Awadhi. He himself knew about a dozen languages, which was not that uncommon at the time. His friend and fellow poet Rangeen helped to collect words, and they both stated that language is shaped by women, both conventional women and courtesans. Why do we call it a mother tongue? Whatever words, they said that whatever words women use become part of the language. Insha also used English words in his poetry. Rangeen said that he learned many idioms from courtesans. And Insha recorded the words and the idioms used by many groups in the city, such as vendors, migrant laborers, and tawafs. He also provides a list of words that are used for men who are differently gendered. So in my novel, Insha is a character, and he is a friend of the narrator Nafis Bai, whom I've invented. And she helps to collect words for Insha's book, which is called Darya-e-Latafat. Her friend Sharad, who's another friend of hers, he is in love with a man, and he also helps her to collect words. This I have made up. Poets like Insha and Rangeen wrote about relationships between men and women, women and women, men and men, all in the same tones. And this is something that I discovered, that it's really the same. It isn't differently depicted. And the tones vary from romantic to melancholy to humorous to playful. So I've argued that courtesans were the female intellectuals of the time. The male poets and the courtesans performed in the same spaces, the same mehfils, in the same courts, for the same patrons who paid them. So courtesans were among the very few women who were able to have non-sexual friendships with men. And this aspect I'm very interested in, friendships between women and men that are non-sexual, which today might seem like easy, but in many earlier times were not easy for many people. So I depict such friendships in the novel. They also had working relationships. Male poets would write poems praising courtesans, and then courtesans would sing and dance to those poems, thus advertising both themselves and their own skills and also the poet's skills. And I depict this in the novel. So I'll just read some short excerpts from the novel. This is an episode where the women are invited to perform at poet Rangeen's house. We know from his writing that they actually were women were invited to perform at his house. Nafis, in my novel, Nafis unexpectedly sings a ghazal by Rangeen, and Chapla dances to this ghazal. She's not expecting it, but she dances, and it's meant as a compliment to her. Nafis is using it in that way. In this ghazal, a woman praises her female lover. Okay, so it's in a woman's voice. The poem is by Rangeen, and the translation is mine. So I'll start reading. That red actually looks lovely on you, Chapla said, popping in while I was getting ready. Her eyes running over me made me shy, and I turned away. Did she remember that I was in red the first time she saw me? Here, let me try something different with your hair. She came up behind me and began to rebraid it. Any number of girls had braided my hair and I theirs, but never had I felt their touch burn through me and reach ears, lips, eyelids, fingertips. While Mir Rangin was supervising the refreshments, Chand and I began to sing and a few others danced. For a while, Chapla sat still, then she stood up and glided over the floor. Everyone broke out in exclamations of delight. Almost surprising myself by my boldness, I slipped into Mir Rangin's ghazal. Startled, he looked up. Chand, surprised, fell silent, and Mir Insha, smiling mischievously, swayed and nodded. Chapla looked taken aback and her skin warmed slightly, the way water does when you pour wine into it, but she kept up with me. है जनाखी मेरी वो लाल परी हो जिसे देख निढाल परी वो चढ़ी गात वाह जी तख्ती वो परिजाद छब जमाल परी खींची कंघी सितम और ढीला पेंच जुल्फ नागिन स्याह बाल परी बोलना खूब रूठना अच्छा हंसना बेदाद और मलाल परी. My Zanaki is the kind of red fairy, Zanaki means my female friend or lover, the sight of whom makes languid any fairy, that swelling bosom, magnificent breasts, fairy born with the beauty of a fairy. A comb pulled back, loosely coiled tresses, locks like a female cobra, a black-haired fairy. She speaks well and gets annoyed well, her laugh incomparable, her melancholy a fairy's. A fairy, or pari really, pari, which I'm translating directly as fairy, was a word used for any beautiful person, especially for a courtesan at the time. She glanced at me, realizing what I'd done. I paused, catching my breath, hoping she wasn't annoyed. Her eyes smiled, amused, flattered, and I continued. It was a longer song than I was used to singing alone, but I managed, and Mir Rangin looked gratified. नाज तूफान कश्म शहर आशोब गमज़दा जुल्म और अदा कमाल परी कुर्ती नादिर कराके की महरम कहर पजामा सर की शाल परी कुंदक पाँव हैं ओदिया रंगीन अलगरज है वो बेमिसाल परी. Her airs, a miraculous tempest, destroy the city. Her grief afflicts one, each movement a fairy's. Her shirt exquisite, bodice splendid. Pajamas wreak havoc, the shawl on her head a fairy's. The tips of her toes are colorful. Truly, she's an incomparable fairy. A storm of applause broke out, directed at Chapla, Mir Rangin, and me. She sank down beside me and whispered, "You're much naughtier than you seem, aren't you?" So that's the end of the excerpt. So in Memory of Light, I imagine how a same-sex relationship might have unfolded in a world that had not yet internalized modern homophobia imported from the West. This had to be a pre-1857 world because 1857, I think, was a watershed in North India. After 1857, Indian worldviews that were earlier open, dominant Indian worldviews, I should say, that were earlier open to many types of eroticism, pleasure, and play, were transformed and to a great degree also erased, maybe temporarily erased, maybe some permanently erased. Much of the literature that I researched remained unpublished, is still unpublished, and I had to copy it out of manuscripts by hand. Poets like Rangin and Jurrat, who wrote freely and irreverently about love, desire, religion, and many other things, were removed from the canon and their work was declared obscene. This is in part, or I would even say largely, because they wrote in detail about same-sex love. Rangin recorded how women formed couples by exchanging food items and how one of these rituals was considered, he said, a marriage between two women. I translated these in my book, Love's Right, and same-sex marriage in India, and I also include one such marriage in the novel. Here is Insha's poem, a bit of Insha's poem, in which a man speaks to a man. Your cheek is made for kisses. Why shouldn't I ask for kisses? As soon as I put my mouth on your lips, the kiss left a red mark there. Locks falling over that face say we have woven a net of kisses. In the morning, cheeks were blue, caused by last night's thought of kisses. The cheeks were blue is a reference to the facial hair that grows overnight. Jaan nikle hai, o miyan, de dal, aaj vada natal, boseka. Oh, sir, I'm dying. Do give it to me. Today, act on your promise of a kiss. And it's a male speaker in the poem. So it's a man speaking to a man. So one of the things I did was I recovered the terms largely lost, and other critics have also mentioned these terms before me. These terms were used for what is called lesbianism in English. For example, chapti, literally sticking or clinging. So poets Jurrat and Nazir Akbarabadi wrote poems called Chapti Nama, meaning a story of chapti. There were words for a woman's intimate friend or lover, such as dogana, which means double or one's second self, one's double. and several other words such as Zanakhi and Elaichi, based on the rituals which were used to form female couples. That ritual about, that Rangin says was a marriage ritual, that I was the first to translate. But it is not just attitudes to same-sex love that change or to courtesans that change. I would say that the entire worldview of educated Indians shifts from the idea that life is, one of the main aims of life is pleasure and joy. There is a shift to the idea that life is all about work and about changing the world, making the world better. Literary critics insisted after 1857 onwards, and I would say to a large extent even today, many literary critics insisted in Urdu, and this is true, I think, of other Indian languages too, that ghazals should not be about love and wine, but should be about nature and social reform. They gave Wordsworth as the example. Poetry should be about nature and about making society better. To write literature that's just for enjoyment comes to be seen as irresponsible and decadent. The point is, what is the moral of the story? What is the message of the poem, right? Not that people stop having fun, of course, but when they write about it, they feel they must give it a serious coloring or a serious turn, at least at the end. This is something that happens in writing more than, not just in life, to some extent in life also. This is a sort of new Victorian importance of being earnest. Everything has to be earnest, serious, and solemn, otherwise it's not good. Ghazals that are, so another thing that happens is that, as we know, if we grew up in India, ghazals that are all about pain and longing and separation, these become the famous ghazals. I didn't even know there were any ghazals about fun, but at this time, there's a huge body of Urdu poetry, which I translate some of it. It's about everyday enjoyment. It's about a proto-consumerist culture, which is why I call it modern, about shopping, about picnics, about parties, large detailed writing about fabrics, about kinds of jewelry, about cosmetics, about dressing up, in women's voices especially. Also, it's poetry that celebrates sex instead of being ashamed of it. And that's also about having flings just for fun, not just serious do or die romance. For instance, Insha writes, this is not in a woman's voice, हंसे बोले रहे मशगूल अपने जिस तरह चाहा इधर लिपटे उधर सोए यहाँ चिमटे वहाँ लिपटे laughing, talking, busily engaged in whatever way desired, embraced here, slept there, clung here, had relations there. This is what I call a very modern tone. And you notice how the colloquial the language is. It's perfectly understandable even today. So the interdisciplinarity of this humanities research, I would say, consists in using the tools of, I use the tools of literary studies, history, linguistics, and gender and sexuality studies to discover the various understandings of what it meant to be human in a time before there was an attempt to flatten them out and make them more uniform. Not that they ever get totally flattened out. And my research on cinema shows one of the places where the courtesan's playful voice goes, the playful ghazal, the playful song, Jaane Kahan Mera Jigar Gaya Ji, is an example of this kind of playful ghazal that persists into cinema when it disappears from the serious literary world. A novel, though, is not about research. It's about the imagination. From doing the research for my earlier books, I had become immersed, my consciousness had become immersed in a world that had come to life for me. It was alive in my mind. And in the novel, I imagined what it would be like to live in that world. The freedoms, but also the limitations. There are limitations, different limitations in that world. We have certain privileges today which they didn't have. For example, today we have much more individual mobility and forms of communication. When I say we, I mean those who can afford it, of course. We have much more of mobility and many more, of course, forms of communication, this being one of them. Separation and parting, therefore, are not so absolute. This may be, there are upsides and downsides to this, but we can travel easily from city to city, often even from country to country, although we're now discovering how easily this mobility can be lost. Most people 200 years ago didn't have this kind of individual mobility. Although courtesans, of course, traveled much more than other women did, and I show that in the novel, still, it would be difficult for them to individually uproot oneself and permanently and move to another city to be with someone, to leave one's household, one's local community. Most people didn't do that permanently. And also, anyone who has read literature in any language knows that love and death are the two aspects of experience that cannot be fully resolved by social change. Even in a perfectly free, equal, and just world, if such a world were possible, one would still lose those whom one loves to death. And one would still face the problem of unrequited love or semi-requited love, the problem of people changing, people growing apart. As the Panchatantra puts it, the loss of friends. That's just going to happen. So how to retain and appreciate relationships as they change? That's the central question in the novel that the narrator and others are grappling with. Okay, thank you. Stop there.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Maybe I can initiate a few questions, and maybe then others can join in if they want to. So my one question is that whenever you talk about, first of all, in Memories of Light, you talk about these two courtesans, friendship and maybe a kind of a romance. Why is it that you chose courtesans and not somebody else? Why was it a kind of a prompted you to make that choice?
Because as I said, courtesans had a kind of freedom and a kind of independence. It's not absolute, no freedom is absolute, but a kind of freedom and independence that most other conventional women did not have. Courtesans traveled independently, they earned independent, they lived in matrilineal households, they had control over their earnings, they had relationships with men, but they didn't live with them full time in most cases. In some cases they got married, but not in most cases. They had friendships and love relationships with each other, with men. So it's a freer world for them than it was for many other conventional women who were living in conventional families and who would only meet the men of their families and otherwise meet the women in their households. It's remarkably different. And so courtesans, I think, are the first modern women. And I think Bombay cinema shows that, the first single women, the first single mothers, the first working women, the first modern women in many senses, the first women to move about freely, to travel from city to city without a man related to them, and so on. So that's why, yeah.
And say for example, like when this kind of issue was taken up in Hindi cinema, the first time probably with Fire, it came. So how is it? If it is to be reflected today, like in today's cinema, so what are the kind of characters that we might pick up? Like even when that film came, The Fire came, it was about these two women in a setup of a marriage in an institution, and then it was kind of slightly not very explicit. It was slightly implicit, and then of course later on it became explicit, and then there was so much of talk in the society about that. But why can't a filmmaker make a film overtly about this topic and it can go on? What is the kind of choice that will be there is something that I would like to your comment.
I thought Fire was very overt. It was very overt, and I had a lot of problems with Fire on other counts, but it did this part very well. It showed it as in the family, women in the family having relationships with their cousins, their sisters-in-law, etc. was not an uncommon thing. It's been depicted in fiction as well. Men also did that, but women more, because men had more access to the public world. There have been other films besides Fire. There's Ded Ishq Kiya, which was based in a world more like the one I've written about, and which was more subtly done than Fire. But if you were paying attention, it was pretty clear what was going on. And now we have, on Men, we have the latest film, the name of which always eludes me, with, it's an odd name, but it was a great film. Zyada Savdhan, that one. Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, and I'm sure there'll be more in future. Now, of course, in the cosmopolitan big city, there are women who are living alone, there are working women, there are women living in families. There are going to be more films that will show a range of relationships. There was another film by, and again, the name is eluding me, where two young women fall in love, right? You know what I'm talking about. It wasn't, again, great as a film. I think Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan was very good as a Bombay film, but this one about the two women was not so good as a film, but it did show a relationship between two women. It was a bit preachy and with a message, but so not so much fun as Shubh Mangal, but I'm sure there are going to be many more films. Yeah.
So there is one more question that somebody called PN is asking. He says, he first of all compliments, he says, very enlightening, Prasavanita. Since you mentioned 1857 as the watershed, I couldn't help but think of Walden coming out in 1854. and his criticism of commercialism and the race for capital. Could you relate the two? And do you think of any particular authors from America who influenced this commercialization in India? So if you have
That's a very complicated. That's a very complicated question. But since you mentioned Thoreau, and I've recently written about Thoreau, I wrote an article about Thoreau, and what I was looking at is the way he's influenced by Indian literature, which that's what he was one of the. He read one of the widest range of Indian philosophical and literary texts at that time. Which he got a whole collection of them and read them. And he also translated one of those texts. It's a bit from the Harivansh. He translated it from French to English. Very interesting. So I was looking at the question of rebirth and the idea of rebirth, and Thoreau believed in the idea of rebirth, and how he looks at animals in that regard, animals and how humans mistreat animals and cruelty to animals. So that was what I was looking at. Yeah, I'm not so sure about what you mean by capital. I mean, what you're saying about capitalism, or asking about capitalism. My point about 1857 was not capitalism at all. My point was capitalism, I think, was going to develop in India, regardless of whether the British had colonized it on India or not. I was talking about the kind of rules and laws that the British bring after 1857. So of course the anti-sodomy law, but also the law regulating courtesans and turning them kind of into sex workers. And also the whole education system and administrative system, they dismantled the Indian systems and replaced it with their own. And when English education happens, then modern Indians internalize a kind of shame and embarrassment about our own culture, whether it is polygamy, whether it is polytheism, whether it is worship of images and icons, which the British call idolatry, whether it is courtesans, whether it is everything we become ashamed and embarrassed about, and start sort of remaking ourselves as Victorian gentlemen, to begin with Victorian gentlemen and then later Victorian ladies. And that's a process still going on. I don't think that has ended, and it's in all our heads. That was the process I was talking about, which many writers have written about, like Ashish Nandy and G. N. Devi, and so on, the whole colonization of the mind, but also the actual colonization of the culture. So that's why I mentioned 1857, not capitalism.
Professor Neetu Kumar has a question. She says the society was far more tolerant in days gone by than it is today. We have compartmentalized every feeling, thus giving rise to dogmatic way of thinking. There is little to no freedom to express love as it was done earlier. When and how do we learn to become more tolerant of each other? Please comment.
I wouldn't take such a pessimistic view. I think today that things have changed and are changing rapidly, and I think a lot of people now feel free to explore a range of relationships and friendships, and talk about and write about those, as you can see if you read modern Indian fiction or cinema. So yes, you're right that at the time about which I'm writing, people didn't categorize themselves by identities. So they didn't use words like gay and lesbian or homosexual, or straight or heterosexual, and so the same person could have relations with a variety of different relations, and it was not seen as anything surprising. But at the same time, they did have words as well. As I said, they did have terms for somebody who is more inclined towards one kind of desire than another. They had terms for that as well. So it's not an either or question. And then for about, I would say, 150 years at least, there was a certain, in the 100 years from say 1820 to 1920, it becomes unspeakable. I translated the works of Ugra on homosexuality, and he was told, you should never write about this subject. Hindi writer Ugra, you should never write about this subject in it's not to be mentioned in polite society. So same-sex desire became kind of unspeakable, which it used to be in the West for many centuries, but never was in India. In India, it was really written about. So it did become silenced for a while, but came back again. I don't think it ever became completely silenced, and it came back again. And now I think it's the love that doesn't stop talking instead of the love that cannot speak its name. So, so things have changed and are changing rapidly. Not changed for everyone equally, of course. In a country like India, there's such a wide range of rural and urban, rich and poor, etc. So it's not going to change completely. But what we're talking about is educated opinion, public opinion, and that has definitely changed. So yeah.
That is, I mean, I'll take one just last question. I wanted to ask, so you researched so much on queer literature, and you are one of the pioneers who wrote about lesbianism. So I mean, when you wrote Memories of Light and you say it was all about imagination, was there something like when you were researching and then something probably that was missing in your research, which kind of fueled you to take up Memories of Light and maybe some more that you write in future? I mean, what is it? Because I mean, in research also you have done so much. It's so broad, and of course at the same time, very deep, very intense. So Memories of Light appears to me very special. I mean, so can you just comment on that? What imagination, what in your imagination particularly prompted you to write Memories of Light?
Well, everybody has a story to tell, and the story I wanted to tell was a love story. And a historical novel is not only about history, it's also about the present. Obviously, I'm writing it now. So it's about the lives now. It's about, so I'm drawing on my own experience, on the experience of others, on the experience of people now, friends now. And love is something which, I don't use the word love. I don't know if anybody has noticed this, but I don't use the word love at all in the novel. I avoided it. It's such a cliched word. So I tried to express it in other ways. But anyway, love is kind of a universal, kind of a cross-cultural experience. And so some feelings, as you can see, if you read, say, Sappho's poems or Tamil poetry from the 5th century, a lot of the feelings seem very modern. They seem very much our feelings. So yes, it's not only all about history, it is also about this, the main story is this love story. And that I could have set it in any period in a way, but this is the period I knew well. This is the period I was really immersed in. So those two things came together, the love story of the two women and the period which my imagination was sort of caught by. So that's how they sort of came together, fused, if you like. Yeah, and I also write poetry. So I've been writing poetry for many years. And so translating the poetry is something that I also enjoy. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Vanitha. I think we will close on that. And what a beautiful feeling to talk about love and romance and literature and history all fused together. I thank you for sparing your time. And, I immediately want to buy Memories of Light and read it quite right away. And I mean, I think I can only say, "Jaane kahan mera jigar gaya ji, abhi yahin tha ghar gaya ji." So that is the thought I hold on to. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.